historic conflicts.
It was the height of the Cold War, a time when the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, waged battles not just with armies, but with ideology, influence, and fear. In December 1979, the Soviet Union made a fateful move, sending tens of thousands of troops into Afghanistan. Officially, Moscow claimed it was there to support a friendly government and maintain stability. In reality, it was a calculated step to secure a strategic foothold in a region that bordered US-aligned states and to keep Afghanistan from slipping into the Western orbit. But the Kremlin underestimated one thing. Afghanistan was no ordinary battlefield. It was a land of rugged mountains, fierce tribal loyalties, and a deep history of resisting foreign rule. The decision to invade would drag the Soviet Union into a decade-long conflict, one that would cost it dearly in blood, treasure, and global reputation. The seeds of defeat were planted from the very first sit-up across the Afghan border. On December 24, 1979, Soviet airborne troops poured into Afghanistan under the cover of night. Their official reason? To honor a treaty of friendship and assist the Afghan government against terrorist uprisings. But the real motive was strategic, to keep Afghanistan within Moscow's sphere of influence and prevent it from drifting toward the West. In a swift, coordinated move, Soviet forces seized control of key airfields and government buildings. The most dramatic moment came when elite Spetsnaz units stormed the Tajbek Palace in Kabul. Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin, accused by the Soviets of unreliability, was killed during the assault, and Babrak Karmal, a Moscow loyalist, was installed as the new president. The Kremlin expected a quick stabilization of the country, perhaps a few months of military presence before pulling back. Instead, they stepped into a political and cultural minefield. Afghanistan's rural population, bound by deep tribal and Islamic traditions, saw the invasion as a direct attack on their faith and way of life. Within weeks, pockets of resistance began to form in the mountains and valleys. These fighters, known as the Mujahideen, would soon become the Soviets' most relentless enemy, united not by a single ideology, but by a shared determination to drive out the foreign occupiers. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union found itself trapped in a nightmare. What began as a quick intervention had turned into a bloody stalemate. The Mujahideen, armed with light weapons and unmatched determination, knew the mountains better than any Soviet map could ever capture. They struck in lightning-fast ambushes, then melted into the rugged terrain, leaving Soviet troops frustrated and exhausted. In 1986, a turning point arrived. The United States supplied the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. Suddenly, Soviet helicopters, once the masters of the sky, became vulnerable prey. The loss of air superiority crippled Soviet mobility and morale. Back home, the war was becoming deeply unpopular. Soviet coffins marked Cargo 200 returned in silence. The cost, in blood and treasure, was mounting, and whispers of dissent began to spread through the Soviet population. Even within the Kremlin, leaders started to question, was Afghanistan worth it? Or was this their own Vietnam? When Soviet troops first entered Afghanistan in December 1979, their strategy was based on conventional warfare, seizing major cities, securing supply routes, and eliminating Mujahideen bases through large-scale offensives. Initially, this approach seemed effective. Armored columns rolled through urban centers, and helicopter gunships patrolled the skies. But the Mujahideen refused to fight on Soviet terms. Instead, they turned Afghanistan's mountains and valleys into a labyrinth of ambush points. Small, mobile guerrilla units could strike a Soviet convoy and vanish into the rugged terrain within minutes. This forced the Soviets to adapt, relying heavily on air mobility and the infamous Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters to provide firepower in remote areas. For a time, the Hind gunships dominated the battlefield, strafing Mujahideen positions and breaking sieges. But in 1986, the arrival of US-supplied Stinger missiles changed everything. Suddenly, the skies were no longer safe for Soviet aircraft. Dozens of helicopters and transport planes were shot down, crippling Soviet air superiority and morale. The war then became a brutal cycle. Soviet forces launched seasonal offensives to disrupt Mujahideen supply lines, while the Mujahideen patiently rebuilt during the harsh winters. Night raids, landmines, and sabotage of Soviet infrastructure became common tactics, bleeding the Soviet army slowly. By the late 1980s, the Soviets shifted to a national reconciliation strategy, focusing less on total military victory and more on training Afghan government forces to handle the insurgency. But the damage was done. Years of adapting to an elusive enemy had drained the Red Army's strength, and the tactical balance had shifted permanently in favor of the Mujahideen. The Soviet-Afghan War left Afghanistan shattered in almost every dimension. Over a decade of relentless conflict turned much of the country into rubble. Entire villages were erased from the map, and fertile farmland became barren due to constant shelling and the widespread planting of landmines. By the war's end, an estimated 1 million Afghan civilians had died, millions more were wounded, and roughly 5 million refugees, nearly one-third of the population, fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. For the Soviet Union, the toll was equally sobering. Around 15,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives. Tens of thousands returned home wounded or disabled, and many carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The war drained billions of rubles from the Soviet economy at a time when the state was already under severe financial strain. Socially, Afghanistan's traditional structures were deeply disrupted. Armed militias and warlords emerged, filling the power vacuum left in the countryside. The influx of foreign fighters and radical Islamist ideologies supported during the war would later evolve into movements such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, shaping global security for decades. On the international stage, the Soviet Union's image suffered irreparable damage. The war became known as the Soviet Vietnam, a humiliating quagmire that eroded its military prestige. For many historians, the strain of the Afghan War was a significant factor accelerating the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Afghanistan, meanwhile, entered a new era of instability, one where the echoes of the Soviet invasion would continue to fuel violence long after the last Soviet soldier left. Thank you for respecting history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and write the bell so you don't miss any battles.